voted the most reliable heating and air conditioning products in the DMV. From the Washington Post, our guy, Barry Svrluga. Barry, good afternoon, buddy. Thanks for the time.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Always a pleasure. So let's jump right in. What does the selection of Eli Willits mean? It's impossible not to ascribe more meaning to it because this is interim GM. Rizzo's been here for 2 decades, no longer with the team. What does that selection mean last night to you?
It means that Mike DeBartolo took control of the draft process and put his imprint on it. I mean, I think there's no other way of looking at it. And I'll say I had a suspicion that, I'm not telling you I knew they were going to pick Eli Willits. I didn't know, the top of this draft class very well. But when Mike DeBartolo sat in that dugout in St. Louis and essentially introduced himself to the Nationals fan base, a fan base that he had quietly worked for 14 years to get to that point, not only did he say, we need real change, and that's kind of writ large across the whole organization, but when asked about, I asked him, look, you're only 5 days before the draft. Can you really make an imprint on it in that short amount of time? And while he said that Danny Haas, the scouting director, and his staff have obviously been working on it for a year, he said right then, the first day, that we're going to look at our options and see how to best optimize the selections that they have. What does that tell you? That tells you you're going to look at underslot options with the first pick, not just because it's about the money there, because you're spending the same amount of money. You're given the amount of money and you're going to spend it. But I think, and I was listening to your discussion earlier, that it's, short of a crime to not take the best player at 1-1. I think if the objective is to inject as much talent at all levels across several picks into your system, then and there's not a Steven Strasburg or Bryce Harper that's, a mile in front of the field in a 1.5-mile race at the top, then you do some creative stuff. I don't have a problem with it, and I'm not trying to stick up for the Nationals or say, Mike DeBartolo is absolutely the person that deserves to get this job going forward. I'm just saying that I think he took a process that he thinks should have been applied in past drafts that have been wildly unsuccessful, and applied it in a way that made sense to him. And the result is not just that you get a really good player at 1-1 who, maybe he doesn't have the highest upside at the top of the draft, but you get better players than you might have gotten with your second, third, and fourth picks because you've got more money to induce them to come into your system and inject it with talent.
What does this pick say for his future? Does this mean that he is pretty confident that the interim tag is going to come off at the end of the year and he's taking over as general manager?
No, I don't think there's any way to know that. I think he is very much auditioning for the job, and he's the only candidate who knows ownership, who knows the franchises, what the franchise does well, what it hasn't done well, the reasons for all that. He's got inside knowledge that other people don't have, and maybe that gives him a leg up. Maybe that puts him behind. I don't know. I'll say 2 things. One, I believe very strongly that they will be doing the franchise and the fan base a disservice if they don't do a thorough search of outside candidates, not just because you need to hire someone from outside, but can we learn how other people think? Can we see how other organizations work? Can we understand why we've lagged behind in X, Y, and Z areas? If at the end of the day you learn some of that from outside sources and you think that Mike DeBartolo is best equipped to deal with the problems at hand, that's fine to land there. The second thing I would say is and this will seem out of left field, but it's really analogous, like when Ted Leonsis finally parted with George McPhee in 2014 as GM of the Caps. He's the only GM that Leonsis had ever had. He promoted Brian McClellan to the big chair. Brian McClellan, who had ridden shotgun to George McPhee for 15 years or whatever it was as his assistant GM. At that time, I was like, are you kidding me? You go through the emotion and the tumult of finally parting ways with your forever GM, and you land on the guy who was sitting next to him the whole time? That's crazy. What I learned in that process subsequently is that McClellan was better than anybody else able to say to Leonsis, here's why we are where we are. this is what we've done wrong in the past. This is what we've done well. Here's how I would improve the things that we haven't done well, and I've seen why it hasn't worked. That's Mike DeBartolo's best case, is that I've seen how we've made mistakes, and I know how to fix them.
Barry Svrluga with us here on G&D. So I like all your points there, Barry, when it comes to Willits. And if it's just a binary baseball discussion, I think reasonable minds can agree or disagree on who the best player is in a process where we don't see any results for years when any of these kids are picked, right? I mean, there's just more development that's got to happen, more maturity that's got to happen. It's not like basketball or football where the results are more instant gratification. It's hard for me not to ask the questions, though, about money, about slot, about Boras. Just address those things that went through your mind, or maybe they didn't at all.
No, 1,000% they have to run through your mind. I mean, that's this questions. We've been taught to question this organization's thinking,
that's it,
right?
Yeah.
So across all those points. Now, I would say, DeBartolo and his people are arguing this is the guy that we had 1-1 regardless, kind of in a vacuum. And that's, as your point, Danny, if that's a baseball discussion, that's a baseball discussion. We can, argue that over a beer and have a good time doing it. And we won't know the results for a while. I think the Boras question is interesting because I was told that not only were they very, very quiet with the Boras candidates at the top of the draft, which would be Holiday and Kate Anderson, the LSU pitcher, they were not in touch with the Boras people in the picks lower. So that kind of tells me that there is a little bit of, or there's potentially a little bit of look, we've been kind of hamstrung by this guy for a long time on many fronts. We're facing situations with Mackenzie Gore, James Wood, and Dylan Cruz that we're going to have to deal with it in the future. Are we always going to be having to trade these guys at their 4.5 or 5.5 years of service because we know they're not going to sign extensions? That's a really, really kind of sickening cycle to be on. I do not know that they just flat out said no Boras this time. I just know that they weren't in touch with the Boras clients that were near the slots where they were drafting. And I think, when we come out of the draft, that's something that has to be answered.
Do you think that when they looked at this team and where it's at right now, we talked last week about this, Barry, and you said, this team is probably further away than you thought it was. And I think just about every Nationals fan, people that cover the team, would probably say the same thing, that when we looked at this year, there's no way that we thought it was going to be worse than the last 2 years. And it looks like it's going to be that way. Do you think that they looked at what's happened on the field this season and said, okay, we'll go with the high schooler, whether it was going to be Holiday or ultimately goes with Willits? Do you think that played into the selection, or you think they just truly went best player on their board?
I think two things, Toby. I think the whole thing about the slot plays into not a question just about best player on their board, which they're saying it is. But I think it's more complex than that because I think the larger question is injecting as much talent into your system as possible. And so if you can get a really good player at 1-1 and then better players at your second, third, and fourth picks, now you've got, if you did it in a WAR kind of rating and say Willits is 3 WAR and the other guys are 2 WAR, 1 WAR, 1 WAR, when you add up that equation, if you had taken Holiday, who might be 3.5 WAR, but you don't have as much to fill in below, then you haven't added as much talent, if that makes any sense to you. So I think it's not just about best player. In terms of where the major league team is, this season is lost. It's about the continued development of Wood, Gore, Abrams. There's the Gore trade question coming up. That'll be really interesting to see how DeBartolo handles that. But I think you have to think of it, if you're in Mike DeBartolo's chair, you're not just thinking about the 26 guys that are going to start the second half at home against San Diego. You've got to look at the entire organization. And I think I was talking to somebody from a different team not too long ago, and they said one thing that is really hard for an organization is if there was a disconnect between what the internal expectations are and what is actually possible. And I think what some people at the Nationals believe is that Mike Rizzo and Dave Martinez thought they were further along than they were, and the reality then makes it that hard to deal with. So I think this is kind of a reset because you're trying to take one draft, make it so productive that it makes up for or helps make up for years of underperformance in the draft. It's actually going to take more time than that, of course. And you want to, it becomes a really interesting question the next off season, because you really, if you don't trade Gore, you've only got 2 seasons to try to be competitive with him. Then you're starting the clock on Wood, which that same point, 4.5 years of service time, would be in 2028. Like, when is there going to be enough critical mass of talent around those guys for the major league team to be successful? I think we're still at the point where, like, stock the system, stock the system, stock the system is really the answer.
Barry Svrluga with us here on Grant and Danny Tobi in for GP. So to that end, Barry, less than 3 weeks now to the trade deadline. It's July 14th, I believe it's the 31st of July this year, so 17 days away. What do you expect the next, just short of 3 weeks to look like here for this organization? I think last year they didn't trade Kyle Finnegan. Now, through unbelievable happenstance, they got him back at a discount, so I guess credit to them, but not really. It's, like you stub your toe to avoid the, it's like, remember Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade when he went to tie his shoe and the saw went over his head? It was the penitent man shall pass, and he knelt by accident. That's kind of how they got Kyle Finnegan back, but I digress. And that was an overruled thing, right? Where it sounded like the people at the front office wanted to trade him, and Rizzo said, no, who's going to close the game? I don't know that I care about that for a team that's going to lose 95 games. But again, I digress. What's the next couple of weeks going to look like? And maybe an acknowledgement of that State of the Union? Or is it we can't afford to start selling off because people aren't coming anyway? What are you expecting here the next almost 3 weeks?
I don't think it'll have anything to do with potential at the gate. I mean, I think if you can find a taker for Kyle Finnegan, you do. The problem there is his underlying numbers are scary. Like you again, talking to somebody from another team, like the fly ball rate is high. He doesn't strike out a lot of guys. You probably would be trading him to a team who would prefer to use him in the 7th, kind of 6th, 7th as a bridge guy rather than a closer. He, of course, gets the counting stats from being the closer on a lousy Nats team. Like, they would value him a little bit higher than maybe other teams would. It'll be really interesting to see what happens there. Gore is the most interesting question, and again, I asked Mike DeBartolo this in St. Louis the first day, like, how do you handle that? And he, kind of deftly was like, look, it's my second day on the job. We haven't gotten that far. We've got the draft coming up. And he did indicate that that's going to involve ownership. My gut is that Mike DeBartolo is going to listen very hard, because I think that he thinks the team is a little bit further away from contending. And we know that he was one of the people that pushed hard for the very difficult Soto trade in 2022. Now, Mike Rizzo had to do that deal. He was the one who executed it. But the thinking behind it was, we have heard Juan Soto say he wants to go to free agency in so many words. It is our duty to maximize what we can get from him. Is that keeping him here and having him play out, hit second or third every night and play here on a losing team? Or is that flipping him for players that could help us in the future? I think we'd all agree that, if Mackenzie Gore, C.J. Abrams, and James Wood were not on this team, like, who would we be watching every night?